My talk today is really sort of a sketch, and I'm going to be dropping a lot of names and stuff like that. Don't try to take notes on the whole thing. You'll pick it up as we go along later in life. But do pay attention to the names, though. If you write anything down, at least try to jot down the names of the people that I mentioned, because that's sort of a framework around which I think we're going to be building a lot of other things. And I assume these names will be coming up in the core course this year. Anything else I want to say? No, I'm ready to go. Okay, John said that we had a human ecology conference in England back in the end of June or early July, and I was there, and I was asked to give one of these kinds of talks about human ecology. So in part of what I'm doing today is drawn from that. It's actually a continuation of it. And I figured, well, the simplest title would just to be to try to talk about human ecology. But my mother was a writer, and she was always correcting my grammar and my punctuation. And so I always have these questions in my mind about when you write something, well, how do you really, punctuate it? And the one possibility, of course, is human ecology a question? And if it's a question, is it a direct question that really is supposed to be answered? Or is it just a rhetorical question? Or maybe it's an emphatic declaration that carries some kind of emotion, which would require an interjection, which is an exclamation point. But my mother always said, don't use exclamation points. They're like laughing. They're like laughing at your own jokes. So then, of course, there's the colon, which is very respectable in academic circles, where usually it's considered to be an invitation to explain things more fully. And in typical academic style, they put in some kind of a long thing after the colon that basically tells you what the whole thing is about before you even start to look at it. And so I was sort of left with only one remaining possibility, which is called the ellipsis, which is just a little string of periods, which is an informal way of saying there's more to come. So that's what we're going to do today. Human ecology, for me, can be characterized by a variety of metaphors, but the metaphor that I want to use today anyway, or one that I find useful, is something like a Picasso painting or a Picasso sculpture, if you know what cubism is, okay? That there's a bunch of facets, and if they're put together in the right kind of way, you get a sense of what it's really about. It really reveals something. And the facets can either reflect, or they may be windows into it, but somehow or other, through a set of facets, you get this general sense of a rather complicated kind of thing. And for us here today, oh, there's my ellipse. Cool. All right. The facets that I want to try to explore, at least briefly, at least point out, is sort of an evolutionary historical facet to human ecology, a contextual way of looking at it, or looking at it as a contextual way of organizing ideas. Look at it in terms of the human mind, in terms of imagination, to look at it a little more deeply in terms of, if you will, the ecology of meaning. Then to sort of take a sidestep and consider human ecology as an interdisciplinary set of problems, or a set of problems that can only be understood in an interdisciplinary kind of approach or through an interdisciplinary domain. And that is sort of the academic research, education, applied approach to the interdisciplinary one. Then finally, something a little more synthetic or more overall integration alike, and in that way look at human ecology perhaps as a perspective. The subject matter of human ecology probably is as old as whenever the first human was around, and as soon as there were humans in the world, the subject matter that we're talking about, human ecology, was there. The human ecologist Gerald Young says the origins of human ecology are lost in the mists of time. There have been a number of Homo species going back some 2 million years. We are the only remaining one. There was a time when Homo sapiens lived alongside Homo neanderthalis in Europe, but the hunch is that we probably took care of them. And there are some other strains that got lost along the way. But the basic story that concerns us, or certainly anyhow me today, is a couple of hundred Homo sapiens, a small group of them, left Africa about 65,000 years ago. and spread out across Asia, down into Australia, up across Asia and Europe, and then around Bering Strait into North and then finally South America. It took up until 1800, just 200 and some years ago, for the human population to reach the first billion. By 1930, we reached 2 billion, and 3/4 of a century later, we're now at 6 or so billion. It is estimated that 1/10 of all human beings who have ever lived are alive today. When we look at the history of that time period, the remains are rather scant. Some bone tools, or stone tools, some scattered bones, some evidence of fire, and some other kinds of burial and things like that. But in any event, the archaeological or human paleontological evidence clearly points to the fact that technology always changes culture. And technology and culture together are always changing our relationship to the rest of the living world. Art also changes culture and expresses culture, and is another way of transforming the natural and the human world. When Homo sapiens went from humans, we went from being nomadic, wandering hunters and gatherers, and finally invented agriculture and started to settle down, we began to make more complex societies with more specialized roles and started to build cities. And right now, here in time, in fact, the conference in Manchester this past summer was about this moment in time. We are at that point where now about half of all human beings live in urban environments as opposed to rural environments. And that's been happening very quickly over the last century or so. Well, I want to digress for a second. I'm a psychologist, and my wife is a psychologist. And one of the nice things about being married to a therapist is that they often know what you want before you know it. Yes, so last summer when we were in England, we were driving around down in southwest in Cornwall and Devon and stuff, tracking around some family history from her family, and then we went over to the east to mine. We had one day left. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We were sitting in a little pub, and she says to me, "What else do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. There's this castle and there's that castle," and she said, "Well, what about this?" So, what is this? Besides John, anybody know what that is? Susan, you ought to know. Suzanne, you ought to know that. Elmer? Come on, anybody? Downhouse. Downhouse? Who lived in Downhouse? Who's that? Chuck. Yeah, Chuck Darwin. All right, Charles Darwin. Okay, and she says, "You wanted to go to Darwin's house, don't you?" I said, "Oh, well, I don't know." She says, so she pulls out her iPod and Googles around. She gets a map. We were about 50 miles away. She said, "Get in the car." So she takes me over there. And it was really a very good call because there was no one there. I mean, there were a couple of caretakers, but it was just us. And I got to spend the rest of the afternoon in the house. And this is his study. This is the very desk where he wrote Origin of the Species. And if you look across the other side, you see that little bookcase? Right, if you get up close, here in the middle is the book called Elements of Geology by Lyell. That is a very important little book because that was the book that he carried with him on the voyage of the Beagle. And Lyell had this idea that the Earth was much, much older than people had thought before, and that the changes in the Earth had been imperceptibly gradual all the way along, and they were still with us here and now. That is basically the idea that Darwin uses in terms of evolution of species. There are slow, imperceptible changes over vast periods of time, and that's what evolution is about. I also find it kind of cute that the book next to it is called Fancy Pigeons, and the one on the other side of it is called The Supernatural in Nature. That those 3 books are all side by side by themselves strikes me as a really interesting little combination. Anyhow, we went through the house and took a lot of pictures we weren't supposed to take, including these. And then went out back, and out back are these magnificent gardens where he had his greenhouses, where he did his research, and this little path called the sand path. He would have this meditative walk he did every day for a period of time, then he'd go and sit down and write and stuff. So anyhow, I just wanted you to know I was there. The point of this is that Darwin had, I think, the really significant insight of looking into time, looking into vast time, and seeing that we are connected to a single source in life, and everything is connected to a single source in life. And as he said later in his life, we are all netted together. Now, when he said that, that was a little controversial at the time, and there were a number of people who were quite disturbed by it. Some people liked the idea a lot, but initially it was sort of earth-shattering to try to explain the diversity of life without doing it in terms of a biblical or a theological or God structure. One of the people that came to Darwin's defense was a German biologist, Ernst Haeckel. This was just a couple of years after he published The Origin of the Species. This is in the 1860s. And Haeckel coined, or at least he's given credit for being the first person to coin the term ecology, which is a combination of the Greek roots ecos for home and logos for the study of. Okay? And as he said there and here, it was meant to be the comprehensive science of the relationship of the organism to the environment. What Darwin did is Darwin gave us a way to think about and to map the past and the deep past of the living world. What Haeckel encouraged us to do is to look at the relationships of the living world here and now, the complexities of what ecology would be. Ecology is a contextual science. This is what Visvader is getting at that little paper I gave you. He's talking about it from a contextual point of view. And as we understand, let's say, life contextually and ourselves in life contextually, it opens up opportunities for us to have insights. And once we have those insights from a moral point of view, you may very well have gotten yourself into a place where you now have responsibility unless you're going to repress what you just discovered. You follow that? Okay. So he's talking about insight or context. And in ecology, that context can range from the study of an individual organism and all of its relationships, or a species and its relationships, which is often called autoecology, all the way to how every living thing connects to every other living thing and all the abiotic stuff, you know, the soil, the rocks, the water, the wind, and everything in the world, which is called a syn-ecological point of view, okay? Autoecological, syn-ecological, small, big. When it comes to humans, we're the species we're talking about, and the scope there can range from, I can do the human ecology of just me in the world, if you will, and that's a worthy thing to consider. Or I can look at it at the level of family, I can look at it at the level of my community, I can look at it through the perspective of a watershed, or a continent, or the globe as a whole, okay? Today, the ones I just want to glance at, context, because I think they're relevant, are the context associated with human migration, with mobility, with communications, and global threats, because I think these are all active contexts right now in which we're involved. How many of you have heard of Aldo Leopold? Okay, this is one of those names that, you know, we'll all get to know better as time goes on. Leopold characterized the distinction I was just talking about between ecology and evolution this way, right? Ecology is a science that attempts the feat of thinking in a plane perpendicular to Darwin, right? It's really about the perception of natural processes. On the one hand, how they develop their forms, that's evolution, and then how they maintain their existence, i.e. how they live together, that's ecology. And ecology, one definition of ecology is to look at the abundance and distribution of an organism. In case of humans, how many of us are there, and where are they? And as with other ecology, plant and animal ecology, the questions come up about how do they move around? How do they migrate? In the case of humans, I don't know if you can we see that? Sort of, you can sort of see it. The blue dots represent those cities in the world where, what does it say? 20, that's not, well, you can barely see that. where 25% or more of the population was not born there, has come from another place. If we add these red dots, these are the other additional cities where there are more than 100,000 foreign-born or migrant residents, okay? If we look at it in a little bit more dynamic kind of way, what you see is that most people are moving towards Europe, towards certain parts of the Middle East, obviously towards America and towards Australia, okay? And basically what that's telling us is that people migrate, they relocate themselves in the direction of where there's opportunities for them. And that's, yeah, sure. The area represents the migration towards it, okay? So not many people are going towards South America. A lot of people are going towards the US, right? Not many people are going towards Africa, but they are going towards Europe or towards certain parts of the Middle East, okay? Another definition of ecology is, or emphasis, more like what Haeckel was saying, is to look at the interaction, look at the ongoing interactions among organisms, or in this case, humans. And if we look at interaction, one kind of interaction is to look at mobility. This is not moving and staying someplace, it's just moving around. And in a second, watch that map on the top left. It's starting to move. See it? Those are all the airplanes flying in a single day. Now, you see the cloud, the morning is coming across Europe now, and you see the flights going from North America and landing in Europe, and Europe's airplanes are waking up. Do you see that? And then as the nighttime is happening on the East Coast, all the planes are landing in the US and everybody's going to sleep. But Asia's starting to wake up. You see that? Right, and then you know, the morning is coming across. See, it's sunrise now on the East Coast, and all the planes are leaving Europe. Europe's lacking, they're always coming over here. The reason when I came across this, I thought, this is really cool. The reason I like it is because we have a house on the edge of Acadia National Park, and we have really dark skies where we live. We live way back in the woods, and on our front porch, I sit on the front porch, and there is never at night a moment when I do not see an airplane going through the sky. And they're always going on that very line right there that's going from Maine. You know, that's, if you go to Europe, you basically leave JFK at 8 o'clock at night, you know, that stream of things. And that, so for me, this is a really neat connection between the big process and my actual momentary experience. And I'm interested in all kinds of connections like that, where we see the connection between our immediate personal experience and the bigger things. The rest of this on here is trying to point to the fact that tourism is one of the biggest, fastest growing industries in the world. And here, Maine, we're it. I mean, the coast of Maine is, I think probably, Ken is, I don't know if it's true, but tourism is probably the biggest industry in Maine now, isn't it? Bigger than forestry or fishing and so on. This is happening all over the world. And big red dots, all the red dots there, are the places where people are going to entertain themselves, right? And there's a lot of mobility. There are right now about 20,000 airplanes in the air during the day. And this is expected to double in the next 15 years. The A380, which is the big new airplane that's going to be coming, that's carbon fiber. It will carry 850 passengers. And here's the curious thing. Because it's going to be lightweight, it will be more fuel efficient per person per mile than the best of the fuel efficient cars. So there's a set of questions in here I think but we're heading in the direction of 1,000-person airplanes and all that goes along with that. On the car front, the black one on the top left is sort of the American dream, at least for a lot of people, the SUV sort of thing. The red one in the middle is the Tata. You've heard of the Tata? Right? That's the rage, or will be the rage, in India. And there are now nearly 650 million cars in the world. That's going to double by 2030. The EPA estimates right now is that the average person drives 12,000 miles a year. And if you multiply all that out, the impact is enormous in terms of the fuel that it will require, the materials that it will be needed to manufacture these, and also the carbon footprints. The map on the bottom shows you where the current ownership of cars is high. That's going to be changing very fast. 200 years ago, the fastest form of communication was a horse. The Pony Express was a big deal, right? It was considered to be a great breakthrough that you could get a letter from wherever you were going, from St. Louis to San Francisco, and I don't know how long it took, 4.5 days or something. That was a big deal. Up until then, it took 3 to 4 weeks to get a letter from Boston to London by boat. I mean, communication was really slow. Just before the American Civil War, telegraph was invented. That was a major breakthrough, followed by telephone, radio shortly after the turn of the century, and then television hit us in the 1950s. The big new wave now in communications is mobile phone. In 1980, there were only a few million mobile phones in the world. Now there are between 2 and 3 billion cell phones. How many of you have cell phones? Good. Okay, we're in there. and in fact, so is the developing world. There is now 60% coverage in the developing world for cell phone technology. This is a huge change in the world in just a very, very short time. 25 years ago, when I started doing this stuff with human ecology, networking human ecology internationally, there was none of this. We didn't have computers. We had one telephone in the college. It would ring and they would yell your name out, and you could come, and then you weren't allowed to make long distance calls because they were really expensive. I mean, this has all changed an awful lot. Obviously, there were no cell phones and any of that. There was no email. There was nothing like that at all. And now, in the last 3 or 4 years, and when we tried to organize a conference, we tried to write a letter to somebody in Indonesia, some guy doing human ecology research on an island in Indonesia, it would take 2.5 months for the letter to get there and come back. And now, everybody out there, we could do it all at the speed of light. And the recent conferences, we've organized them with no mail anymore at all. It's just a huge transformation. Anyhow, how many of you, does Michael Jackson matter? Anybody care about Michael Jackson? Yes. Yeah, we do? Nobody, a little bit? Okay. This is another little London thing. As we were coming out of the subway at Piccadilly Square in London, we were stumbling around looking for different kinds of things, and we turned around a corner, and here is the theater where he was going to do his debut performance, and there was a pile of flowers like that big. It looked like Princess Diana had died. Yes, I mean, there were all these flowers, and there were all these people standing around. Some of them were quite sad and tearful and stuff. Anyhow, I happened to run across a piece of information that right after he died, there were 240 million text messages in the hour afterwards. Right? Did any of you do that? You did? Okay. And I divided that out. That's 4 million text messages a minute, 65,000 a second. That's incredible, right? I mean, that's the kind of connectivity in the world that we've got to pay attention to. It is world changing. Anyhow, where now? So surely the human world is becoming more connected. But on the other side of the coin, our connections with nature are severely lacking. This is the internet IP address thing. Lewis Thomas, I don't know if you've ever heard of Lewis Thomas. This is a very celebrated scientist. He wrote some important books, Lives of a Cell, The Medusa and the Snail. He was also a trustee of Ecology of the Atlantic. And he says, the only piece of scientific truth I know for sure is that we are profoundly ignorant about nature. There are about 1.5 million known species of plants and animals and so forth now. We discover about 15,000 new species every year. But the consensus is that the vast majority of species are still unknown. Right? This is what he's talking about. He's also talking about other things too. But at the same time, the E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, believes and has said that a fifth of these species will go extinct in the next 30 years, even without us ever having known them. Okay. And the causes are, we know what the causes are. They're pollution, habitat destruction, climate change, and other kinds of human development activities. The little map there on the bottom shows the threatened species of plants, more or less, and the one on the right, threatened species of animals. But we too are victims of our successes. In the world, currently, barely, there are 7,000 languages, 7,000 different languages that are spoken. It's estimated that half of them will disappear in this coming century. This is a huge loss of cultural diversity. It's not just a loss of words. It's a loss of whole histories and whole systems of thought and whole ways of life. So, what was that last one? Did I screw that up? What was that one? Oh, sorry. They all look alike to me. Actually, they don't. This is interesting. Hold on. You see that the deforestation, it tends to run along the tropical areas, right? But the language extinctions don't. A lot of the language extinctions are much further afield. So. Yeah, but I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that the tropical deforestation is where you've got the greatest species diversity. And so those things are obviously connected to each other. Anyhow, environmental problems and human problems are inseparable. In many ways, there are not really environmental problems, right? We're the environmental problem, or a lot of the problems of the environment aren't caused by the environment. They have a lot to do with our impact on the environment. And when the environmental movement started, back in whenever you would say it, the 1960s, 1970. The first Earth Day was 1970. Is that right, Ken? Yeah. So, okay, somewhere around there. It revolved around this question. It revolved around the question of, can nature absorb the impact of humans? Yes? Can nature absorb the impact of humans? I think the question is changing a lot. And it's becoming more a question of, can human consciousness comprehend our relations with the living world, right? It's less a problem of what nature can do. It's more a problem of whether or not we can do anything with it. This is not a new idea. It goes back very far, but one person who influenced me was Aldous Huxley. I assume people have read something by Huxley. What, Brave New World? Right, well, Huxley was quite a serious biologist and a lot of other things, too. He comes from this extraordinary family. But he said back in I think it was probably in the 50s, he said that the thing we need to do is to get an understanding of ecology in our collective heads, right? And this is what got me interested in the ecology of mind. It got me interested in environmental psychology, and it's really what brought me to COA. Here were a bunch of people huddled around a wood stove in the middle of winter, eating brown bread, and wanting to save the environment. And I wanted that, as a psychologist, that was pretty exciting for me to come in. It was like there was this lost tribe out here on this island. And we came up here and we studied. We lived with them. They weren't dangerous. They were vegetarians. And so that's what got me started on it. But what I was really looking for is, how does a new idea, this idea of ecology, come into the world, and how do people act in the presence of a really different worldview, or in the development of a different kind of worldview. This is the same sort of thing in the paper that you've got there by Paul Shepard, written at about that time. What he was saying back then is the basic problem, the central problem of human ecology is really the relationship of mind and nature. This brings us to our third facet, imagination. And the first two are sort of extrospective, standing outside, if you will, human ecology and so forth, and looking at it or trying to look in it. This is more like, let's get inside and see where, from the mind, things, how they appear by looking outward, right, and from the point of view of imagination. And imagination is defined as the act or power of forming a mental image not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. One of my favorite writers of imagination, especially in terms of evolution, is Lauren Isley. And Isley was a really skillful essayist who wrote these subjective self-discovery pieces, but they were evolutionary. He didn't talk about it like a textbook does. He talked about it from the point of view of experience, of really being able to feel being inside the living world that way. And his notion is that the human mind, what he called, he said there are two worlds. There's the first world of whatever we would say, plants and animals, and then when humans come along, there's a second world, because we have this mind thing that comes along with it. We have this capacity, as he says here, to transcend time. That means we can get out of living in the ever-present moment, and we can imagine the future, or we can remember the past, right? We have that capacity. What time do I have till? Do I have till 3:30 or so?
You can transcend time.
I can, but you can't. You'll get tired. You'll get drowned, right? What, a half hour maybe? Because this is about midpoint for your attention. 4 more minutes? Okay. All right, good. Well, there's other side stories here that when I look at this stuff, I want to go off in other kinds of directions. Just one brief thing here. At about the time you all were being born, they were tearing down the wall in Berlin. You know, that was when the Iron Curtain came down and the Soviet Union broke apart and stuff like that. And the last prime minister, president of the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev. And he's gone on to become sort of a celebrated hero in sort of green international relations stuff. But he got thrown out. But he was trying to save the Soviet Union by having it reimagine its own future. And he started, this is the time when we had Ronald Reagan as president in this country. And a lot of people thought that Ronald Reagan wasn't a real intellectual. But Gorbachev would start these political speeches with this phrase, and I always liked it. He was trying to stir, he was more like a Barack Obama. He's trying to stir people up to about, we can make a change. And he started his speeches with this phrase. He said, "Ever since humankind first conceived the morrow." You got that idea? Right? Imagine there you are grunting and scratching under some tree, and all of a sudden you're hungry and I'm going to sleep, and then you say, "But tomorrow." And then you've got and then when you get up tomorrow, the world is different because you're moving towards something that's in your mind. You follow me? What he wanted people to do was conceive a new Soviet Union and blah, blah. Well, it didn't work. He got thrown out. But that idea is the idea that I think is really important here, that the mind has this capacity to imagine the future and then make the future come true. And that's what this little picture is here. Presumably somebody or other thinking about going hunting tomorrow. And our imagination can take us to all kinds of places, some of them sort of hyper-real, surreal, or fantastic. They can also represent for us the wonder of nature, or the horrors of losing nature, and so on. So the human imagination has a lot to do with charting the possible futures. It takes us beyond science and social science into the realms of creativity, arts, and aesthetics. So if this is the halfway mark, let me see if I can sum up for a little bit, at least where we are. When I was a kid, there was a famous broadcaster. His name was Edward R. Murrow. And Edward R. Murrow did a lot of things. He confronted a lot of political difficulties at the time. But one thing that he did that was really important to me is he developed a show called This I Believe. And what he did was he asked people to write their personal beliefs, right? And they would send them in. And if they were, these were famous people and ordinary people. And some of them would be selected, and then that would be on the air. They've resurrected that now, and it's on National Public Radio. Have you heard of This I Believe? Some of those are really sweet. I mean, I warn you, you're going to have to do this, right? Because I don't know if they told you yet, that in your third year you have to write a human ecology essay. That's basically this, right? It's for you to sit down by yourself and say, okay, this is what I really believe. I think it's a really important exercise. I think everybody ought to do it probably every 3 years. Just pause and say, what am I really doing here? Yes? That kind of idea. So if somebody said to me, Rich, your time has come, here's what I would have to say I believe. And I mean it. I really believe there is a living world out there. I don't have any, I mean, I don't want to become sort of a weirdo, skeptical, idealist philosopher. I think it's really there, okay? And I also think, this is why I'm a psychologist, or maybe I'm a psychologist because this is true, I also think there's this other place over here called the mind, and it's different than the rest of stuff. It's not, doesn't operate in the physical realm, it operates in other kinds of, consciousness is its own stuff. And I think the mind and the world are connected to each other. And the ways that we connect them mostly are through our capacity to perceive and language, our capacity to note, and nominalize, and name the world, and through our behavior and through our actions. This is how we're connected. This is how mind and nature are connected for me. Okay. The anthropologist Roy Rappaport, cultural anthropologist, said once, as he was looking at all the different languages in the world and all the different kinds of cultural diversity, he also said, but we should remember that every language has words for what is, what was, what could be, what should be, and what never will be again. Okay? We have words to name the objects of the world. We have words to describe our memories and what has caused the world, how the past is caused. We have words for what could be, the possible future. We have a language structure for what should be, a moral structure, and we have a set of things where we do know how to say, this is over, this is dead, this is gone, this is extinct, right? That's the basic structure of language. In the 1960s, in 1963 in Chicago, there was a housewife who had gone to a very good private college, who didn't enjoy being a housewife anymore. And she wrote a book. And in the book, she talked about a problem without a name. The book, the name of the book, anybody know what the name of the book was? Somebody said it. Feminine Mystique, right? And the woman was Betty Friedan. And what she did, the problem without a name, that's a great concept, right? Because there is something that's waiting to be named, and she named it. And it became the women's movement. And she went on to be president of the National Organization for Women and led the equal rights movement and all that sort of stuff. But there are times in experience where we have an intuition, a buried intuition, individually in your own life or collectively, we have an intuition, it starts to come up, and we've got to figure out what it is that's going on with ourselves or with it. That's, for me, that's where the ecology, human ecology thing was coming. It's an idea starting to come into the world, and it's up to us to try to figure out what it really is and make it happen. Okay. There are a number of people who have done this in different kinds of ways. Last year we used Annie Dillard's book, who I like very much. Annie Dillard is a writer. She wrote Tinker at Pilgrim's Creek and a variety of other kinds of things. She agrees with what I'm saying here. She says the universe is real, right? It's not a dream, but also thought advances and the world is created. We create the world too with our thinking. She does that at the level of meaning making in the literary world of imagination. On the more practical level, below is Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg was a really interesting character. He wrote an important book called Design with Nature. And he created the Human Ecological Planning Program at the University of Pennsylvania. Started it back in the 1960s. Now the story goes, and it's sort of half true, so that's good enough for me, that Ian McHarg has had a lot to do with the founding of College of the Atlantic. I don't know if anybody's given you any of this creation mythology of this college yet, but here's one drop. There were two local businessmen. Somebody tell you the story yet? There was Les Brewer, who's still alive and around, and a Catholic priest, Father Jim Gower. And they had grown up and played football together on the MDI, or the Bar Harbor team and all that sort of thing. They were buddies. And after this big fire on the island back in the 40s, they were trying to rebuild the island. They said, what do we want to do? And they said, well, why don't we have a college, right? And so the idea was that and this was, by then we were into the Vietnam War, and there was all this stuff going on. They said, well, gee, why don't we have a peace college, right, where we teach peace studies? We'll call it what do we call it? We'll call it Acadia Peace College, okay? And they sort of were rolling around that in their head. And then one day, Jim Gower was driving around in his old Saab, and he hears on the radio a lecture by Ian McHarg. And Ian McHarg is ranting on about, human ecology. And it hit Father Jim, and he comes back to this little group of people that are trying to create the first board of trustees, and he says, I've got it, right? Let's make an ecology of human ecology. Okay. That's one piece of the truth of why you're here, why I'm here, or why this is here. Okay. Anyhow, Ian, here I'm going to use some of his words, right, from one of his papers on human ecological planning to get a sense of how he put his thinking together. It goes like this. He said, human ecological planning is a cumbersome and graceless title. Right? Remedy, however, while possible, is distant. When it becomes accepted that no ecosystem can be studied without reference to man, then we may abandon the human descriptor and revert to ecological planning. Better still, when planning always considers interacting biophysical and cultural processes, then we can dispense with the distinction of ecological and simply employ the word planning. However, that state is far in the future, as most planning today excludes the physical and biological sciences, ecology, ethnography, anthropology, epidemiology, and concentrates instead mostly on economics and sociology. He was right. I mean, there was a lot of bad building that went on for a long time with big bulldozers and a lot of concrete that paid no attention to the living world. And McHarg is one of the people who brought a lot of this into consciousness through his own and actually trained a couple of generations of regional planners that have really been important, including our own Gordon Longsworth, who runs the GIS lab, and our past chairman of the board of the trustees here, Sam Hamill, were students of Ian McHarg. Well, I got to know Ian McHarg in a couple of different ways, but I really spent some time with him back in the 90s in Scotland when they had a meeting of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It was a big environmental thing, and we were invited to come and talk about Ecology of the Atlantic as this institution and blah, blah, blah. And we were on, the then president, Lou Rabineau, and I and McHarg were on a panel together. We were up there, and I can't imitate McHarg. He was so huge. I mean, he was the biggest ego in the world. But I really got to like him, and as long as he wasn't standing in front of a lot of people, he was really sweet. So we went out in the evenings and drank beer and did things like that, and I got to know him. And then he came and got involved with the college, and he was very helpful to us in a lot of different kinds of ways. But while I was in Edinburgh, on the last day of the conference, another thing happened to me. And as I was sort of getting my stuff together and getting ready to walk out, these two men from China walk up. Their English was not particularly good. And they were very polite, and they gave me a little gift, and we chit-chatted and stuff like that. And they said, we do human ecology over here in Beijing. And I said, that's sweet. And so on and so on. And that was over, and I came home. And a couple of weeks later, I go to my mailbox, and in my mailbox is a package. I pull it out, and I open it up. And inside the package is a book and a set of articles. And the title of the book is Human Ecology in China. And I go, oh, I like this. And I open up the book, and the book starts with this. It says, human ecology in China is 2,500 years old. Right? And he wasn't kidding. Right? He goes back through Chuanzi, and he goes back through Lao Tzu, and he goes back through Confucius, and he talks about all these human ecological systems of thinking, about the relationship between humans, nature, heaven, the qi, the energy, the life force, and all that sort of stuff. And I said, oh, I love it. So I wrote him a letter and invited him to come to COA, and he did. And he and Visvader and I have hung out quite a bit. In fact, John and I have gone back to China and taught human ecology inside the Chinese Academy of Sciences to sort of play this human ecology east and west thing. It's like two different schools of medicine come together. They've got all their sort of energy points in the flow of stuff, and we've got nerves and stuff squirting around, and you're trying to talk to each other and say, oh, what fits here? Then anyhow, we played that game. But when the first time Rusang came here, he came and he taught a class with me. He just came into class, and here is him. And here is we didn't have PowerPoint presentations then, yes. We had acetate overhead projectors, right? And this is the acetate that he used in that class. The characters across the top are the Chinese characters that say human ecology. It's a combination of mankind, living organism, state dynamics, and science. Anybody here read Chinese? Can you recognize any of that? right? And if you look at the state or dynamics thing, it breaks it apart, which includes both energy and capability, i.e. sort of material causes, but also includes the heart and the brain. Yes, it's a beautiful symbol, where in one symbol those things are actually hooked together. And this is his writing, and this is his translation of it. You know, human ecology is the science of living state dynamics of human beings driven by objective and subjective planners and using that to understand things, to plan, and to manage stuff. Yes? I thought that was so cool. And in that year, I used to, in my core course, I haven't taught a core course. I mean, this is the first year I haven't taught a core course section in a long time. And I used to have a tradition of having people in my section come over to my house and we'd make T-shirts, right, with something that was human ecological on the T-shirts, you know, with a screen thing. And that year, what the students did is they made a T-shirt that had this on the front, and on the back it just said human ecology. So if somebody walked up to you and looked at you and said, "What's that mean?" You just turn around and point to the back, right? And if somebody came up to your back and said, "What's human ecology?" you would just turn around and let them see the Chinese. I thought it was really clever. John, do you still have one of those? I still got mine. Yeah, we used to give them out to the instructors. Anyhow, that's not important. Okay, our fifth facet is to look at human ecology as an interdisciplinary domain. This is really a term that comes from the academic literature of human ecology of try to find some way to start. What are we talking about here? We're not talking about it being a discipline itself. We're talking about a domain in which interdisciplines are related. H.G. Wells, I assume everybody's read something by H.G. Wells. What? What'd you read? War of the Worlds? The Time Machine? Time Machine? Anybody read any of the other stuff by him? He was a super scholar, you know, and he was a historian, among other things. And he wrote a book. I thought this was very modest. He wrote a 1,000-page book on history, and the title of it is The Outline of History, right? And it's a very human ecological book. It starts the first 5 chapters of his history book. There are no human beings yet, right? He's really going back through geological and natural history and stuff like that. He lays it out, and then humans come in, and he talks about humans come in and so on. He was very much a pioneer of human ecological thinking and a strong advocate for it. So too was or is Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth. And he was involved with and very helpful to the forming of the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, which is the British system human ecology network for all of the various Commonwealth nations. They held their first conference in Malta in 1970, about the same time as COA was founded. And here's a statement that he used as an opening statement about this is a difficult subject. People will be afraid of it, but it's very, very important that we do it. Another person who was also involved in this in a similar kind of way was Indira Gandhi, who was Prime Minister of India. Indira Gandhi was murdered, is that correct? Was she killed? There's a human ecology center at the University of Jaipur in Rajasthan named after her called the Indira Gandhi Center for Human Ecology. And Ken, you've been there, right? Right. These ideas have been percolating around in the world. We're not the only people out there. The sense of them was captured by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, who said there are no psychological problems or sociological problems or economic problems. There are just problems. And as a rule, they are complex. And that's what we're trying to get our head around, right? The way we carve up knowledge in the academic world is not a very good representation of how the world really is. Yes, it makes a convenient way to study it in peace, but very hard to understand it as it really is altogether. And that has a lot to do with the way we use architecture, the way we build buildings around ideas or points of view to keep them separated from each other. Thoreau, and I know everybody knows Walden, right? Well, if you go back and you read through I think it's a chapter on economy where he's in the bean field counting beans or something, he starts to meditate on universities, on colleges. And here's what he says here. He says the mode of founding a college usually is to get the money together and then blindly follow the division of labor. Yes, and what he means is when he graduated from Harvard in 19 1837, there were only a couple of hundred students in his class. Harvard then was just a little bit bigger than we are now here, yes? But already, and I think their campus at that time was 15 acres. Ours here is actually bigger than Harvard was in 1837. But already the buildings were built and they were separate from each other. They were built in a campus style. Campus is the Latin word for field, yes? Buildings were set out in the field, right, and separated. Ideas, the departments were already separated from each other, right? 100, 150 years later, the Harvard campus was scattered all over the place in Cambridge. And now it wanders out into Boston and stuff like that. One cynic once said, in describing Harvard, it said, Harvard is a loose confederation of departments held together by allegiance to a central heating plant. I don't mean to pick on Harvard here, because what I'm talking about is all universities are that way. And I love universities, and I've been at some really big ones. I was at the big Ohio State when I was there, had 65,000 students, yes? Right? That's bigger than the biggest city in Maine. It's bigger than Portland, Maine, by a lot, right? And that was a university, right? It was really good at doing a lot of stuff. I mean, it was a great place to, but it was a bad place to try to put ideas together. That's what I'm trying to get at with this, okay? This was not unnoticed, and this was not unnoticed even at Harvard. The famous, well-known philosopher, metaphysician, mathematician, Alfred North Whitehead was at Harvard, and he wrote a very important little book, which I hope some of you, especially those of you in education, will read sometime, called The Aims of Education, right? And the aims of education, if you boil it down, he says it pretty clearly in a sentence not long after the beginning of the book. He says, the aim of education is the acquisition of the art of utilization of knowledge. Now, I know that phrase really well because the first president of College of the Atlantic, Ed Kalber, had come from Harvard, and he had read the aims of education. And he in almost every little speech he gave year after year, he would remind us of the aims of education are the acquisition of the art of utilization of knowledge. That's a really good phrase, though. If you read it backwards, right, knowledge, right, the knowledge should have uses, utilization of knowledge, right? The utilization of knowledge is an art, right? Education is the acquisition of that art. That's a good thought, right? It really involves creativity, but it also involves knowledge itself. Another person who was a champion of this point of view is Gregory Bateson. If you've not heard of him, he's another one I would hope down the road we get to know. His books, Steps to an Ecology of Mind and Mind and Nature, were really influential for me to break out of just thinking like a psychologist. And what does it mean to bring ecology into my mind or into mind at all? And in fact, Bateson spent a lot of time talking about where is mind in nature, not just in your head, but isn't nature mind-like itself? Doesn't nature know how to do what it does, which in philosophy is called epistemology? And nature has, every plant has its own epistemology and knows how to be what it is, right? And how do we understand those knowledge systems that the living world really is? And he was very concerned that we don't break what he called the pattern which connects. Not just the pattern which connects when we view life, but in education, the pattern which can connect ideas to other ideas should not be broken, because when you do that, you destroy real quality. And last year in the New York Times, there was an article by the professor at Columbia, Mark Taylor, and the title of the article was "The End of the University as We Know It," and in it he decried the fragmentation of specialist limited knowledge that all too often is irrelevant to genuinely important problems. And he goes on to say, if higher education is to thrive, it must be completely restructured. We need to create problem-focused programs. What he's talking about is doing things like we're doing here. Now, it's going to be impossible to take a giant university like Purdue or Ohio State or Harvard and mush everybody together to make it happen. But there can be opportunities or ways in which people can be put into combinations to look at the bigger kinds of issues and stuff. A couple of years ago, David Hales, you've all met David Hales by now, yes? Okay, the president before him was Steve Katona. Steve Katona was original faculty member here and then stayed on and became president. And he was at a conference in higher education. And somebody decided to play a trick on the presidents. And they got a copy of every institution's mission statement, you know, that little brief thing that says what your institution is about. And they chopped them all up and put them in a bowl and passed the bowl around to the president and said, pick out your mission statement, right? Steve Katona was the only person in the room who picked out his own mission statement because all the rest of them don't look any different from one another. Yeah, I think that's a good story, actually. Okay, so here he is. This is Ed Kalber. He's still around. He and I have dinner. He's a very good cook, and my wife and I like to cook, and we get together every 2 weeks and do a little cook-off. And Ed's way of representing or trying to represent human ecology, and this is actually something he wrote after a frustrating faculty meeting that was going on and on and on about stuff. And he stayed up one night and he wrote this long little treatise, and I've always liked this piece of it where he says, human ecology is a perspective or a point of view or a way of looking at the world, if you will, which signals the importance of finding effective ways of interrelating disciplines and of relating thought to practice. That's really clean for me. I mean, it's this notion of it as a perspective it gives you the opportunity to not have to overly define it, but still we know what we're trying to get our minds around, the kinds of issues we're trying to get our minds around. Some people have done this. At the philosophical level, I've always liked Whitehead. So when I first came here, everybody read Whitehead. It was sort of de rigueur to play around with Whitehead. Our philosopher at the time, Dick Davis, was a Whiteheadian. His roommate, who he'd gone to Yale with, who was actually the physics professor and also taught law, was also a Whiteheadian. The president was a Whiteheadian. So the rest of us sort of had to be Whiteheadians just to fit in. So in the core course, back in those days, we all read Whitehead and tried to figure out what he meant. Nobody can really understand it. It's hopelessly complicated. And so anyhow, but I have a copy of his collected works. And when they were at the publisher just before he died, he was given a chance to review them. And he wrote handwritten letter back to the publisher of some thoughts that he had, afterthoughts about the whole collected works, and then he died. And what the publisher did was thoughtfully put a facsimile of that letter in the front of the book, you know, so the handwritten letter. And in that book is a statement which I've always liked a lot. The progress of philosophy is not about reactions of agreement or dissent, right? It's essentially about the enlargement of thought where contradictions and agreements are transformed into wider points of view, okay? This is what Ed was talking about a perspective, this notion of there are wider points of view, that we can find knowledge that's useful, there's kinds of fresh combinations. I think this is what we're trying to get to happen. And this has happened, there are many people who do this, but another one of my favorites is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson certainly influenced my life. People know this, her name? What's the book that you, Silent Spring, okay. She wrote a variety of, Silent Spring is sort of the bestseller, or the most controversial, or sort of the breakthrough. Her other things were more scientific. She was a terrific writer. She was actually a poet. And she could put ideas and sensitivities and feelings together in a really, really exquisite kind of way. I think she opened the door to environmental consciousness, perhaps more than any other single writer, because she was such a good writer. And if any of you have any of you seen her Sense of Wonder book? She wrote a book for children. She wrote it for her nephew, right? And it's about going out and experiencing nature. It's a really good little book. You should read it. It was actually a magazine article that was turned into a book. Anyhow, for her, knowledge is important, but every bit is important. Perhaps more important is also to allow yourself to feel. The Silent Spring was about pesticides and how they go through the ecological systems of the world and their effect on birds and so on and stuff. It was highly technical, but it was also a story about her love of birds, right? It was the title, The Silent Spring, was not just a factual statement. It was an emotional statement. So, let me give a little push, and then I want to bring this to a closure. Between the philosophical and the personal, what I'm talking about there, between Whitehead and Carson, we need to develop integrating perspectives. We need to apply them at all levels. I think Paul Shepard was right. Ecology was, and will continue to be a subversive science right? It will confront us with insight or possibility of insight and responsibility. He says in there, and I like it, he says we need to go towards nature. Not away from nature, not against nature, towards nature. And I hope you guys can talk about what that might mean a little bit. The real promise of human ecology, as he says in there, will not be research reports. It will be more like works of art. And by that, I mean, I think painting is a wonderful thing, but I don't think he's talking about making nice paintings. He's talking about living artfully, that our cities and our landscapes will become works of art, that we can combine what we know scientifically and what our aesthetic capacities together. We need to change education at all levels, from formal education and public education to education for decision makers. We need to, we know that technology has always changed culture, and we need to work with the technology that we're surrounded with. We are right now in an avalanche of technological change, right? We need to figure out how to use it, to penetrate the walls between islands of knowledge as tools for synthesis, to arrange affairs so that people will work together, and to guide growth and manage complexity. C.P. Snow, someone hopes you encounter at some point down the road, talked about that we actually live in the Western world in two sort of cultures of knowing. One of them we could call science, and a different way of knowing that we call the arts. The paper that you have there by Bill Carpenter is about this, right? He starts out, my father is a landscape painter. He goes out on a little expedition with his father, and he discovers his father moves a tree in the painting. And he gets very disturbed, poor little Bill. So he goes off and buys a Hawkeye camera to come back and record the truth. Yes? That's this. What little Bill was concerned about is the truth. That's what scientists are concerned about. What his father was concerned about was the art, what is beautiful. Yes? And therein is a fundamental distinction. And these points of view are held together and line up with different kinds of values. Science, look at search for truth, tends to line up pretty well or better with economic values, with political values, with issues of money and power. Those things sort of line up neatly. It's a rational way of being in the world. The arts tend more to line up with values of aesthetics, of what is beautiful, of social values, of things like love, more ineffable, or spiritual values of unity. Yes? This is more on the emotional. This is a different kind of thing. Our challenge here now is to how do we merge these things together? How do we bring these aspects? That's the big interdisciplinary problem. There's a billion little ones, but the big one is how do we put these things together? And this is partly why I've asked you to look at those particular papers in your discussions. We need to continue to expand on our metaphors and different ways of looking at the world through the lenses of biomimicry or sustainability or conservation ecology, eco-cities or watersheds or food sheds. These are the language that we're starting to invent that will help us start to see our way into new ways of thinking. I think we need to pay attention to that kind of language. And we're right now moving into this food shed thing. You know, we're about to hire somebody. We're going to be developing a thing on food systems and so on. And in closing, I want to just relate one small story. There is a reasonably well-known environmentalist by the name of David Orr, O-R-R. And David Orr has written a couple of books that are quite popular. One called Ecological Literacy, another called Earth and Mind. He was the architect, conceptual architect, not the actual builder architect, of the greenest building on a college campus at Oberlin College a few years ago, the Environmental Studies Center and so on. He's a very interesting kind of guy, and I've known him for a long, long time. I knew him long before he was at Oberlin, and back when I first got here, some of us on the faculty here, would sort of go out and network with other people out at other environmental programs around the country. And there was a program at Harvard, and there's one at Yale, and there's one at Dartmouth, and there's one at the University of Vermont, and blah, blah. There was not a lot of them, but there were some of them out there in the beginning. And in the fall, we would all gather in this little river valley in northern Arkansas, where David Orr had a little environmental retreat center called Meadow Creek. And he would have academics come and talk about curriculum and share ideas and, complain about, something or other. We didn't have enough students or the world wasn't right. And we get to meet some of the young Washington new EPA professionals. And it was a way to get people to know each other. It was the beginning of a professional group. And at lunchtime there, this one day, some students showed up and they said, we made a little movie. We'd like to show the movie. And they said, oh yeah, sure, show the movie. And the movie was, the students had gotten a little grant to go out in the summer and do a research project. And what it was some student going down the line in the cafeteria of this little college, and not this college, a little college, it was actually Hendrix College, going down the line and picking their lunch, right, and putting it on their tray. And there was I don't know what it was a hamburger, and there was a banana, and there was some milk, and whatever was out there. And then what they did was the camera then sort of goes into the cheeseburger, and then you trace the different parts of it backwards. So the hamburger goes back onto the grill, then goes back into the kitchen, and then goes into the freezer, and goes into the box of other hamburger, and then goes back out onto the truck, and then they ride the truck back to the packing slaughterhouse. Which then they go through the slaughterhouse, you go through all that, and you go back out into the field, and then you meet some farmer who introduces you to a cow, right? Then they did the same thing with the lettuce. Right? And they did the same thing with the tomatoes, and the same thing with the bread, and the same thing with whatever, the banana. Yes? And I tell you, my lunch has never been the same. Right? That little movie just showed me the truth of the way that I'm connected to all these little guys. And this was just a bunch of students that come up with this idea. It was really, really, now that everybody's got this idea now. But back then, that was an honest insight, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, it was an honest insight. So I think that's important, and I think it's important is it sort of shows us that human ecology can be totally personal. Not totally personal. It can be very personal, right? But it also shows the importance of what students, the imagination of students can do in terms of changing things. And this was in the spring, I came across a contest, a video contest for something called Climate Matters. It was a Climate Matters video contest. It was to create a public service video, yes? And the winner of that video contest, anybody seen this thing? Okay, well, I'm going to show it to you. It's the last thing I'm going to do. It's only 20 seconds. Watch closely, if it works. You get that? Have anybody seen that before? All right, you want to see it again? Let me do it one more time because watch what's in there. Watch it closely. I mean, he's quick. This kid's 10 years old. I had to slow that down and almost do it frame by frame to get it. And what's in what he's got, I think he's almost got it all in there. It goes from the personal, from his family, their car, fuel prices, a dirty windshield, his father's hands on the pump, to smokestacks and air pollution, economics, hurricanes, floods, endangered species, oil spills, polar melting, and global climate change in 20 seconds, right? Now, there's a 10-year-old kid who I have no doubt has a human ecological perspective, right? If he can do it, we can do it. Thank you.